The German shepherd's claws scraped against the white pine coffin with desperate fury, his howls echoing through Millbrook Cemetery as 73 mourners watched in stunned silence. Pastor Mitchell's prayer book slipped from his trembling hands, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. This wasn't grief. This was warning. Mrs. Rodriguez screamed and stumbled backward into her husband's arms as Ranger's powerful paws splintered the coffin's edge. The funeral director shouted for help, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. Even the gravediggers froze, shovels suspended midair. Bill Campbell stared at his granddaughter's coffin, remembering how Grace had whispered, "Ranger will find me," just hours before she'd closed her eyes forever. The dog had appeared at their doorstep 6 months ago, the same week Grace started having those strange episodes. "Get that animal away from my granddaughter!" Margaret Campbell shrieked, her face pale as cemetery marble. But what if Grace wasn't really gone? What if the loyal German shepherd knew something that would shatter everything they believed about love, death, and the terrifying lengths people go to protect those they cherish most? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millbrook, Pennsylvania had always been the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, and tragedy traveled faster than gossip. With a population barely scraping 3,000, the small town nestled between rolling hills and cornfields had weathered its share of heartbreak, but nothing quite like the Campbell family's string of losses. Bill Campbell sat on his front porch every morning at 6:30 sharp, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands as he watched the sunrise paint the sky above Main Street. At 74, his once broad shoulders had begun to curve inward, bearing the weight of too many farewells. The diabetes had stolen the feeling from his fingertips, and his heart skipped beats like a scratched record, but those ailments paled beside the deeper wounds that never seemed to heal. 3 years ago, his son Michael and daughter-in-law Sarah had died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Route 15, leaving behind 6-year-old Grace and a mountain of medical debt that still threatened to swallow the Campbell home whole. Bill's Ford dealership pension barely covered the mortgage, let alone the $127,000 in hospital bills that arrived like monthly reminders of his failures. Margaret Campbell moved through their modest 2-story home like a ghost haunting familiar rooms. At 71, she carried herself with the careful precision of someone whose body had begun to betray her, arthritis gnarling her fingers, memory sometimes slipping like sand through a broken hourglass. For 40 years, she'd taught second grade at Millbrook Elementary, nurturing other people's children with the same fierce devotion she'd given her own. Now, watching Grace struggle with nightmares and mysterious dizzy spells, Margaret felt every one of her 7 decades settling into her bones. "Lord helps those who help themselves," Bill would mutter, when the bills arrived, his father's favorite saying offering cold comfort as he divided $43 between groceries and Grace's school supplies. Margaret would pat his shoulder and whisper her own inherited wisdom. "Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind." Though lately, those words carried a weight that made her stomach turn. Grace, Elizabeth Campbell, was sunshine wrapped in a 6-year-old's curiosity, her blonde curls catching light like spun gold as she chased butterflies through the backyard that had once echoed with her father's laughter. She spoke in complete sentences that sometimes sounded too old for her years, as if tragedy had aged her spirit faster than time should allow. Her green eyes held depths that made adults uncomfortable, the knowing look of a child who'd learned too early that people you love can disappear without warning. The German shepherd had appeared on a Tuesday morning 6 months ago, sitting perfectly still by their mailbox as if he'd been waiting for an invitation that never came. Margaret had tried shooing him away, but Grace had named him Ranger before anyone could object, slipping him scraps from dinner and whispering secrets into his patient ears. Bill couldn't afford dog food, but somehow Ranger never seemed hungry, and Margaret suspected their neighbors were enabling Grace's attachment to the stray who'd claimed their family without permission. None of them could have predicted how desperately they'd need that loyalty in the dark days ahead. The morning Grace collapsed started like any other Tuesday in October, with Margaret grinding pills into applesauce while humming Amazing Grace under her breath. The mortar and pestle had belonged to her mother, once used for crushing herbs and making remedies, now serving a purpose that made Margaret's hands shake with each circular motion. 3 Ambien tablets dissolved into powder, then stirred until they disappeared completely into the sweet, innocent mixture. "Breakfast, sweetheart," Margaret called, her voice steady despite the war raging in her chest. Grace skipped into the kitchen wearing her favorite yellow dress, the one with sunflowers that made her look like a beam of light, even on the darkest days. "Can Ranger have some too?" Grace asked, already reaching for an extra spoon. The German Shepherd sat perfectly still beside her chair, amber eyes tracking every movement with an intelligence that unnerved Margaret more each day. "Dogs don't eat people food, honey," Margaret replied, watching Grace take the first spoonful. "Just like people don't understand dog thoughts." For 3 weeks, Margaret had been increasing the dosage gradually, half a pill ground into Grace's evening milk, then a whole one, then 2. The child's energy had begun to fade, her bright chatter replaced by long afternoon naps and complaints of feeling fuzzy. Dr. Burke had suggested blood tests, but Margaret had deflected with talk of growth spurts and childhood phases, buying time she desperately needed. The medical bills had arrived again yesterday, another $400 reminder of Grace's emergency room visit last month when she'd fainted at school. Margaret had sold her wedding ring to a pawn shop in the next county, trading 47 years of marriage memories for $300 that wouldn't even dent their crushing debt. Bill didn't know about the ring yet, and Margaret prayed he wouldn't notice its absence until after she'd found the courage to finish what she'd started. "I feel sleepy again," Grace murmured, her eyelids already growing heavy as the medication took hold. "Can I take a nap with Ranger?" Margaret's throat constricted. Grace had been taking more and more naps lately, sometimes sleeping 14 hours without waking. Bill had started asking questions, worry creasing his weathered features as he watched his granddaughter fade like a flower without water. Margaret told him it was normal. Children needed rest to grow, but privately she knew the truth was far more complicated. She'd calculated the final dose carefully, researching online at the library when Bill thought she was volunteering for the church cookbook committee. 30 milligrams would be enough. Peaceful, painless, merciful. Grace would simply drift away in her sleep, free from a future of poverty and hardship that 2 failing grandparents couldn't prevent. Margaret had even written the note, hidden in her recipe box. Grace went to be with her mommy and daddy. Sometimes love means letting go. As Grace curled up on the living room couch with Ranger pressed against her side, Margaret felt her resolve crystallizing into something she barely recognized. The dog's eyes seemed to bore into her soul as if he could sense the darkness growing in her heart. She'd tried to send him away countless times, but he always returned, always positioning himself between Grace and whatever threatened her. "Silly dog," Margaret whispered, but her voice caught on the words. By afternoon, Grace could barely keep her eyes open. She'd eaten lunch mechanically, speaking in whispers that made Bill lean closer to catch her words. When she stumbled walking to the bathroom, Bill had insisted on calling Dr. Burke, but Margaret intercepted the phone call with practiced excuses about flu symptoms and the need for rest. "Maybe we should take her to the hospital," Bill said, his thick fingers trembling as he felt Grace's forehead. "She's not right, Maggie. Something's not right." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to smile. "She'll be fine, William. Children bounce back faster than we do. Let her sleep it off." That evening, As shadows lengthened across Grace's pale face, Margaret made her final decision. She ground 6 pills this time, enough to ensure Grace would slip away peacefully in her sleep. No more pain, no more worry about money or medical bills, or whether 2 elderly grandparents could provide the life a bright 6-year-old deserved. Ranger seemed to sense the change in the air. He refused to leave Grace's side, growling low in his throat whenever Margaret approached with the doctored milk. His hackles rose, and his amber eyes held an accusation that cut straight through Margaret's rationalizations. "It's for the best," she whispered to the dog, but the words tasted like ashes. "You'll understand someday." As Grace drank the milk without complaint, her trust absolute and heartbreaking, Margaret felt something inside her chest crack and crumble. By morning, she told herself, the suffering would be over for all of them. She had no idea that Ranger had other plans entirely. Grace didn't wake up Wednesday morning, and by noon, Margaret's carefully constructed world began to crumble like autumn leaves beneath a harsh wind. The child lay motionless in her small bed, her breathing so shallow that Bill had to lean close to feel the whisper of air from her lips. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that reminded Margaret of the porcelain dolls she'd collected as a young woman, beautiful but lifeless. "Call Dr. Burke," Bill commanded, his voice cracking with panic as he shook Grace's shoulder gently. "Call him now, Maggie. Something's terribly wrong." Margaret's hands trembled as she dialed the familiar number, each digit feeling like a nail in a coffin she'd built with her own twisted love. "Doctor." Harrison Burke arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag clutched tight as he climbed the stairs to Grace's room with the urgency of a man who'd seen too much death in his 59 years. Burke's examination was thorough and increasingly grim. He checked Grace's pulse, lifted her eyelids to examine her pupils, listened to her heart and lungs with the stethoscope that had delivered countless diagnoses over his 25 years of practice. Margaret watched from the doorway, her guilt eating at her insides like acid while she maintained the facade of a worried grandmother. "Her vital signs are extremely weak," Dr. Burke said finally, straightening up with the weight of bad news heavy on his shoulders. "Heart rate is barely 40 beats per minute, blood pressure dangerously low. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." "No," Margaret said too quickly, then softened her tone when both men stared at her. "I mean, can't you treat her here? The hospital bills from last month nearly broke us. Surely if it's just the flu." Dr. Burke's gray eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion crossing his weathered features. He'd been the town's primary physician long enough to recognize when something didn't add up, and Grace's symptoms reminded him of cases he'd rather forget. His own daughter, Rebecca, had presented similarly 8 years ago, the same pallor, the same frightening stillness, before they'd discovered someone had been poisoning her with household medications. "This isn't the flu, Mrs. Campbell," Burke said carefully, watching Margaret's face for any telltale signs of deception. "Grace appears to be in some kind of coma. Her pupils are pinpoint, her breathing is depressed, and frankly these symptoms suggest possible drug toxicity." The words hit Bill like a physical blow. He sank into Grace's desk chair, his face draining of color as the implications sank in. Drug toxicity. But Grace doesn't take any medications except her vitamins. How could she have been exposed to drugs? Margaret felt the walls closing in around her, but she'd come too far to turn back now. "Maybe she got into something at school," she suggested weakly. "Children are curious. They put things in their mouths." Dr. Burke wasn't buying it. His medical instincts, honed by decades of experience and sharpened by personal tragedy, were screaming warnings. He'd learned to trust those instincts after failing his own daughter, and everything about Grace's condition pointed to deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. "I'm calling an ambulance," Burke said firmly, reaching for his cell phone. "Grace needs immediate medical intervention. Gastric lavage, activated charcoal, possibly dialysis. Every minute counts." "Please," Margaret pleaded, her mask finally slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. "Can't you just let her be comfortable? If she's going to, if this is her time." The silence that followed was deafening. Bill stared at his wife with dawning horror, while Dr. Burke's suspicions crystallized into something approaching certainty. In the corner, Ranger whined softly and pawed at Grace's motionless hand, his behavior increasingly agitated as the adults debated the child's fate. "Let her be comfortable," Bill repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maggie, what are you saying? This is our granddaughter, our baby girl." Margaret's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as 40 years of teaching experience and maternal instincts warred with the terrible decision she'd made. "We can't afford to save her, William. The medical bills will destroy us, and then what? Two sick old people trying to raise a child with special needs? I've seen what poverty does to children. I've seen them go hungry, wear second-hand clothes, get teased at school because their grandparents can't provide." Dr. Burke stepped back instinctively, recognizing the confession for what it was. His mind raced through the medical timeline, Grace's recent symptoms, her increasing lethargy, Margaret's resistance to medical intervention. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "What did you give her, Margaret?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent dealing with medical emergencies and human tragedy. Margaret collapsed into herself, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her terrible secret. "Just sleeping pills," she whispered. "Ambien. I ground them up in her food. I thought it would be peaceful, like going to sleep and not waking up. No pain, no suffering, no more worry about money." Bill's strangled sob filled the small bedroom. He looked at Grace's pale face, then at his wife of 47 years struggling to reconcile the woman he'd loved with the monster she'd apparently become. "How long?" he managed to ask. 3 weeks, Margaret admitted. "Started with half a pill, then more. Last night I gave her enough to finish it." Dr. Burke was already dialing 911, his professional training overriding his personal shock. But as he spoke rapidly to the emergency dispatcher, he couldn't shake the feeling that they might already be too late. Grace's breathing had become even more shallow, and her skin was taking on the bluish tinge that preceded respiratory failure. Ranger's behavior grew more frantic, his whines becoming sharp barks, as if he were trying to wake Grace through sheer force of will. The loyal German shepherd seemed to understand what the humans were only beginning to grasp, that time was running out for the little girl who'd shown him kindness when the world had forgotten he existed. The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing, cutting through the afternoon stillness of Millbrook like a knife through silence. Paramedics rushed up the Campbells' front steps, their equipment bags bouncing as they took the stairs 2 at a time. Margaret sat in the hallway outside Grace's room, her face buried in her hands, while Bill paced like a caged animal, his weathered features etched with disbelief and rage. "She's upstairs, first door on the right," Dr. Burke directed the EMTs, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. 6-year-old female, suspected drug overdose, been unconscious for approximately 8 hours. Vitals are critically depressed. As the paramedics worked over Grace's small form, checking her pulse and preparing an IV line, Ranger became increasingly agitated. The German shepherd circled the bed, whining and pawing at the blankets, his amber eyes fixed on Grace's face with an intensity that made even the experienced medical personnel pause. When they tried to move him aside, he planted himself firmly beside the bed and refused to budge. "Sir, we need this dog out of here," one of the paramedics said to Bill. "He's interfering with our ability to treat the patient." But Ranger wouldn't be moved. He seemed to understand that Grace was in mortal danger, and his protective instincts had kicked into overdrive. Every time someone approached the bed, He would position himself between them and Grace, not aggressively, but with a determination that spoke of absolute loyalty. His behavior was so unusual that even Dr. Burke found himself studying the animal's reactions, wondering what the dog might be sensing that human medical training couldn't detect. The next few hours blurred together in a nightmare of medical terminology and desperate interventions. Grace was rushed to Millbrook General Hospital, where Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician, worked frantically to stabilize the child's condition. Blood tests confirmed Dr. Burke's suspicions. Grace's system was flooded with zolpidem, the active ingredient in Ambien, at levels that should have been fatal. "I've never seen a child survive this level of toxicity," Dr. Williams told the assembled family members in the hospital's sterile waiting room. Her body weight, combined with the dosage indicated by her blood levels, frankly, it's a miracle she's still breathing. Margaret had been questioned by police officers, their gentle but persistent inquiries leading to a full confession that shattered what remained of the Campbell family's facade of normalcy. She was arrested but released on her own recognizance, the officers taking pity on an elderly woman whose crime had been born of misguided love rather than malice. Still, the reality of her actions hung over the family like a dark cloud. Bill struggled to process the magnitude of his wife's betrayal. 47 years of marriage, and he'd never suspected the depths of despair that had driven Margaret to such desperate measures. As he sat beside Grace's hospital bed, holding her small, cool hand in his large, trembling one, he replayed every conversation, every moment when he might have recognized the signs of his wife's deteriorating mental state. "I should have known," he whispered to Dr. Burke, who had remained at the hospital to monitor Grace's condition. The way she kept saying Grace was better off in heaven with her parents. I thought she was just grieving, trying to find comfort in her faith. I never imagined. Dr. Burke nodded grimly, his own memories stirring. "Mental illness can make people do unthinkable things, Bill. Your wife isn't evil. She's sick. The combination of grief, financial stress, and what appears to be early-stage dementia created a perfect storm." Throughout Grace's first night in the hospital, Ranger maintained his vigil. The staff had initially tried to remove him, but Dr. Williams had intervened after witnessing the dog's extraordinary behavior. Ranger seemed to know when Grace's vital signs were dipping, becoming agitated seconds before the monitors would sound their alarms. His presence, while unusual, appeared to have a stabilizing effect on the child's condition. "I've heard of therapy dogs," Dr. Williams confided to Dr. Burke during one of their consultations, "but I've never seen anything quite like this. It's as if he's monitoring her more closely than our equipment." As the hours passed, Grace's condition remained critical but stable. The medical team had pumped her stomach and administered activated charcoal to absorb the remaining toxins, but the damage to her system was extensive. Her breathing required mechanical assistance, and her heart rhythm was irregular. The waiting game began. Would her young body be strong enough to recover from the systematic poisoning she'd endured? Margaret was released into Bill's custody with strict conditions, including mandatory psychological evaluation and surrender of all medications in the house. The ride home from the police station was conducted in suffocating silence, both elderly spouses grappling with the ruins of their relationship and the uncertain fate of their granddaughter. "I wanted to save her," Margaret finally whispered as Bill helped her up the front steps of their home. "I know you can't understand, but I truly believed I was saving her from a life of suffering." Bill's response was measured but filled with pain. "Maggie, we made vows before God to love and protect that child. What you did, I don't know if I can forgive it. I don't know if I can forgive myself for not stopping it." The house felt different without Grace's presence. Too quiet, too empty, haunted by the echoes of a childhood that had been cut short by an act of misguided mercy. Margaret moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching Grace's toys and clothes while wrestling with the magnitude of what she'd done. The rational part of her mind knew her actions had been wrong, but the desperate, broken part still whispered that she'd been trying to spare Grace from the poverty and hardship that seemed inevitable. Back at the hospital, Grace's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse during the early morning hours of her second day. Her breathing became even more labored, and her heart rate dropped to dangerously low levels. The medical team prepared for the worst, calling Bill and Margaret back to the hospital with the grim warning that they should prepare themselves. Dr. Williams worked with quiet efficiency, adjusting medications and monitoring equipment while the family gathered around Grace's bedside. The child looked impossibly small amid the tangle of tubes and wires, her face peaceful despite the battle raging within her tiny body. Ranger had positioned himself as close to the bed as possible, his head resting on his paws, eyes never leaving Grace's face. "Her body is shutting down," Dr. Williams explained gently. The toxicity levels were simply too high for someone her size and age. "We're doing everything we can, but—" The unspoken words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret broke down completely, her sobs echoing through the sterile hospital room as she faced the ultimate consequence of her terrible decision. Bill stood frozen, watching his granddaughter slip away and knowing that his wife's actions had made him an unwitting accomplice to this tragedy. As Grace's vital signs continued to deteriorate, something remarkable happened. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, as if he'd heard something the humans had missed. He stood up, placed his front paws on the edge of the bed, and began to whine softly, his nose inches from Grace's face. The monitors showed no change, but the dog's behavior suggested he was detecting something beyond the range of medical equipment. Dr. Burke, who had remained at the hospital throughout the crisis, found himself studying Ranger's behavior with growing fascination. The dog's acute senses might be picking up subtle changes in Grace's scent, body temperature, or even electrical activity that their machines couldn't detect. As a man of science, Burke was skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured and quantified, but his personal experience with loss had taught him to respect mysteries beyond medical understanding. "What is it, boy?" Bill whispered, reaching out to stroke Ranger's head. "What do you know that we don't?" By Thursday evening, the medical team had done everything possible. Grace's condition had stabilized at a critical level, but she showed no signs of consciousness. The machines kept her body functioning, but her spirit seemed to have retreated to some unreachable place. Dr. Williams prepared the family for the possibility that Grace might never wake up, and if she did, there could be permanent brain damage from the prolonged exposure to the medication. "We'll continue supportive care," she assured them, "but realistically, you should consider making some difficult decisions about her long-term care." That night, as Margaret kept her vigil beside Grace's bed, she whispered her confessions and pleas into the darkness. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. Grandma made a terrible mistake. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just a scared old woman who didn't know how to face the future. Please come back to us. Please give us another chance to love you the right way." Ranger never left his post, his unwavering loyalty a stark contrast to the human failures that had brought them to this crisis. As Friday morning dawned, bringing with it the reality that Grace might never recover, the dog's behavior began to change in ways that would soon challenge everything the medical team thought they knew about life, death, and the bonds that connect all living creatures. By Friday afternoon, Dr. Williams delivered the news that Bill Campbell had been dreading. Grace's brain activity had flatlined during the early morning hours, and despite the machines keeping her body alive, all neurological responses had ceased. The official time of death was recorded as 11:47 a.m., though her heart continued to beat with mechanical assistance. "I'm so very sorry," Dr. Williams said softly, her professional composure barely masking her own grief. Grace fought harder than any child I've ever treated, but the toxicity levels were simply too much for her system to overcome. The brain damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation was extensive. Margaret collapsed against Bill's shoulder, her keening wails echoing through the hospital corridors. 40 years of teaching had shown her many grieving parents, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight of being responsible for a child's death. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to save Grace from suffering, she had caused the ultimate suffering for everyone who loved the little girl. Bill stood like a statue carved from granite, his weathered hands gripping Grace's still warm fingers as if he could somehow will life back into her small body. "She's really gone?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Our baby girl is really gone?" The medical team began the delicate process of preparing the family for what came next. Organ donation wasn't possible given the circumstances, but arrangements needed to be made for Grace's body. The machines would be turned off within the hour, and then the painful process of saying goodbye would begin in earnest. Ranger's reaction to Grace's death was immediate and heartbreaking. The German Shepherd seemed to understand what the humans were only beginning to accept. He whined softly, pawing at Grace's hand, then began a low, mournful howl that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the room. When the nurses tried to lead him away, he planted himself firmly beside the bed and refused to move, his amber eyes fixed on Grace's peaceful face with unwavering determination. "That dog hasn't left her side for 3 days," one of the nurses observed. "It's like he's standing guard over her soul." Dr. Burke found himself deeply moved by Ranger's loyalty. The dog's behavior reminded him of his own daughter Rebecca, and how their family cat had refused to leave her bedside during her final illness. There was something profound about the bond between animals and children that transcended human understanding, a purity of love that made their grief seem almost sacred. The funeral arrangements fell to Bill, as Margaret was deemed too emotionally unstable to make rational decisions. Washington Funeral Home, a family business that had served Millbrook for 3 generations, handled the preparations with gentle efficiency. James Washington, the current director, had buried 3 generations of Campbell family members and understood the particular weight of this tragedy. "Small casket, white with brass handles," James suggested during their consultation. "We'll hold the service at First Presbyterian, where Grace was baptized. Pastor Mitchell has already offered to officiate." Bill nodded numbly, signing papers and making decisions that felt surreal. How do you plan a funeral for a 6-year-old whose life was cut short by her own grandmother's misguided love? How do you explain to a community that had watched Grace grow up that she'd been murdered by someone who claimed to be protecting her? The news of Grace's death and the circumstances surrounding it spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Small towns had long memories and strong opinions, and the revelation that Margaret Campbell had poisoned her own granddaughter sent shockwaves through the close-knit community. Some residents expressed sympathy for an elderly woman driven to desperation by financial hardship, while others demanded justice for an innocent child. "It's unthinkable," Mrs. Helen Rodriguez told her husband as they watched the evening news coverage. "Margaret taught my children. She was always so gentle, so caring. How could someone like that do something so horrible?" Pastor Thomas Mitchell struggled with his own crisis of faith as he prepared Grace's eulogy. He'd counseled the Campbell family through their son's death, officiated at Grace's baptism, and now found himself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How do you speak of God's love and mercy when a child dies at the hands of someone meant to protect her? The wake was scheduled for Sunday afternoon, with the funeral to follow on Monday morning. James Washington worked carefully to prepare Grace's small body, his experienced hands gentle as he dressed her in the yellow sunflower dress that Margaret had chosen through her tears. The child looked peaceful, almost as if she were simply sleeping, which made the reality of her death even more heartbreaking. Ranger's behavior during the wake preparations was extraordinary. He followed Grace's casket from the hospital to the funeral home, walking alongside the hearse with the dignity of an honor guard. When they arrived at Washington Funeral Home, he positioned himself beside the casket and refused to be moved, even when offered food or water. "I've been in this business for 30 years, James Washington told his wife that evening, "and I've never seen anything like that dog's devotion. It's as if he's protecting her even in death." The wake drew hundreds of mourners from across Millbrook and the surrounding counties. Grace's teachers from school came to pay their respects, along with classmates and their parents, neighbors, and community members who had watched the little girl grow up. The viewing was especially difficult for those who had known her as a bright, energetic child full of curiosity and joy. Margaret attended the wake despite the hostile stares and whispered comments from other mourners. She sat in the front row beside Bill, her face gaunt and aged beyond her 71 years. The weight of her actions had transformed her from a respected retired teacher into a pariah, someone whose presence made others uncomfortable and angry. "How could you do it, Maggie?" whispered Mrs. Betty Morrison, one of Margaret's former teaching colleagues. "How could you hurt that precious child?" Margaret had no answer that would satisfy anyone, least of all herself. Yes, the rational explanations about financial hardship and fear of poverty sounded hollow in the face of Grace's still form lying in the small white casket. She'd convinced herself she was showing mercy, but now she saw her actions for what they truly were, a selfish act of cowardice disguised as sacrifice. Throughout the wake, Ranger maintained his vigil beside Grace's casket. Mourners had to walk around him to pay their respects, and many found themselves moved to tears by the dog's obvious grief. Children especially seemed drawn to Ranger, perhaps recognizing in him the same innocence and loyalty that Grace had possessed. Dr. Burke attended the wake with mixed emotions. As the physician who had tried to save Grace, he felt the weight of professional failure despite knowing he'd done everything possible. His own memories of losing Rebecca were painfully fresh, and watching another family destroyed by preventable tragedy reopened wounds he'd thought had healed. "She was a special child," Dr. Burke told Bill during a quiet moment. "Grace had a wisdom beyond her years, a kindness that would have made her an extraordinary woman. I'm so sorry we couldn't save her." Bill's response was measured, but filled with pain. "Dr. Burke, you did everything you could. The fault lies with my wife, and my own blindness to what was happening under my own roof. Grace deserved better from all of us." As Sunday evening approached and the wake drew to a close, preparations began for the funeral service the following morning. The casket would be transported to First Presbyterian Church, where Pastor Mitchell would attempt to find words of comfort for a community grappling with senseless loss. Grace would be buried in Millbrook Cemetery in a plot beside her parents, finally reunited with the family that had been taken from her too soon. But Ranger had other plans. As the funeral home staff prepared to close Grace's casket for the final time, the German shepherd's behavior shifted from mournful acceptance to desperate agitation. He began to pace around the casket, whining and pawing at the edges, his amber eyes reflecting a knowledge that no human could understand. Something was wrong, and Ranger was the only one who knew it. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, as if the Pennsylvania sky itself was mourning the loss of Grace Campbell. First Presbyterian Church filled beyond capacity, with mourners spilling out onto the front steps and sidewalk. The small white casket sat at the front of the sanctuary, surrounded by flowers and the overwhelming weight of collective grief that pressed down on everyone present like a suffocating blanket. Pastor Thomas Mitchell stood at the pulpit, his usually steady voice wavering as he looked out over the congregation. In 40 years of ministry, he'd conducted countless funerals, but nothing had prepared him for the task of eulogizing a 6-year-old whose life had been cut short by her own grandmother's twisted mercy. His prepared words felt inadequate, hollow echoes in the face of such senseless tragedy. "Grace Elizabeth Campbell was taken from us too soon," Pastor Mitchell began, his voice cracking with emotion. "But in her brief time on earth, she touched more hearts and brought more joy than many people manage in a full lifetime. She was sunshine wrapped in a little girl's laughter, curiosity made manifest in endless questions, and love given freely to everyone she met." Margaret sat in the front pew beside Bill, her face a mask of devastation that had aged her decades in just 5 days. The hostile stares from other mourners felt like physical blows, and she could hear the whispered condemnations that followed her everywhere now. "Child killer," some called her. "Monster," said others. The truth was somehow worse than the accusations. She was a broken old woman whose love had become poison, whose protective instincts had transformed into the very thing she'd sought to protect Grace from. "I keep thinking about the last thing she said to me," Margaret whispered to Bill, her voice barely audible above Pastor Mitchell's eulogy. "She asked if Ranger could have some apple sauce, too." Even at the end, she was thinking about others, wanting to share what little she had. And I was killing her with kindness she didn't even know was tainted. Bill's response was a strangled sob that drew glances from nearby mourners. His granddaughter's final act of generosity, wanting to share her breakfast with a stray dog, highlighted the innocence that Margaret had destroyed with her misguided attempt at mercy. The irony was crushing. Grace had died trying to take care of others, while the person meant to care for her had become her executioner. Ranger had been allowed into the church despite initial protests from some congregation members. The German shepherd lay beside Grace's casket with the stillness of a marble statue, his amber eyes fixed on the small white box that contained his beloved companion. His presence added an element of profound sadness to the already heartbreaking service, a living reminder of the loyalty and love that Grace had inspired in all who knew her. Dr. Burke sat several rows back, struggling with his own grief and professional guilt. Despite knowing he'd done everything medically possible to save Grace, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have recognized the signs of deliberate poisoning sooner. His experience with his own daughter's death had made him sensitive to such possibilities, but Margaret's carefully constructed facade of concern had initially fooled even his trained eye. "Grace believed in the goodness of people," Pastor Mitchell continued, his words echoing through the packed sanctuary. "She saw potential friends and strangers, found joy in simple moments, and loved without reservation or condition. Perhaps that's why she was able to form such a strong bond with Ranger, a homeless dog who needed exactly the kind of unconditional acceptance that Grace offered so freely." The service proceeded with readings from Scripture, hymns that Grace had loved, and testimonials from teachers and family friends who shared memories of her bright spirit. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about Grace's habit of leaving drawings on neighbors' doorsteps, small gifts of childhood art that had brightened countless days. Her former teacher, Miss Sarah Chen, described Grace's insatiable curiosity and her habit of asking questions that made adults think more deeply about the world around them. But as the service neared its conclusion and pallbearers prepared to carry Grace's casket to the cemetery, Ranger's behavior began to change dramatically. The dog that had maintained a solemn vigil throughout the funeral suddenly became agitated, whining and pawing at the casket with increasing desperation. His amber eyes darted between the mourners and Grace's still form, as if he were trying to communicate something vital that no human could understand. "Something's wrong with that dog," whispered one of the ushers to James Washington. "Maybe we should remove him before he disrupts the procession." But Dr. Burke found himself studying Ranger's behavior with growing fascination and a creeping sense of unease. The dog's acute senses might be detecting something that human perception had missed, something that medical training and modern equipment had failed to register. As a man of science, Burke was skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured and quantified, but his personal experience with loss had taught him to respect mysteries beyond medical understanding. The procession to Millbrook Cemetery was a somber affair, with hundreds of mourners following Grace's hearse through the tree-lined streets of the small town. Ranger trotted alongside the vehicle carrying his beloved companion, his behavior becoming increasingly frantic as they approached the final destination. By the time they reached the gravesite, the German shepherd was barely controllable, whimpering and circling the casket with an urgency that made even the most skeptical observers pause. Margaret watched Ranger's distress through a haze of sedatives and grief, her mind struggling to process the dog's obvious agitation. Something in his behavior reminded her of the way he'd acted in Grace's hospital room, the way he'd seemed to know things about the child's condition that the medical equipment couldn't detect. A terrible thought began to form in the back of her mind, a possibility so horrifying that she couldn't give it voice. "Bill," she whispered, grabbing her husband's arm with trembling fingers. "Look at Ranger. He's acting just like he did at the hospital when Grace's condition changed." What if something's wrong? Bill followed his wife's gaze to the increasingly agitated dog and felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Ranger's behavior was indeed reminiscent of his hospital vigil, the way he'd seemed to anticipate changes in Grace's condition before the medical monitors registered them. But Grace was dead. The doctors had confirmed it. The death certificate had been signed, and they were here to lay her to rest. As the graveside service began, Pastor Mitchell's words were nearly drowned out by Ranger's increasingly desperate whines and barks. The dog circled the casket like a wolf protecting its pack, his amber eyes reflecting a knowledge that transcended human understanding. Several mourners began to murmur among themselves, some suggesting that the dog should be removed, others wondering if his behavior meant something more significant. "In sure and certain hope of the resurrection," Pastor Mitchell intoned, but his words faltered as Ranger's distress reached a crescendo. The German shepherd was now pawing frantically at the casket, his claws leaving scratches on the white surface as he tried desperately to reach Grace. Dr. Burke found himself moving closer to the casket, his medical training warring with what seemed like impossible hope. Could there be some explanation for Ranger's behavior that didn't require belief in miracles? Could the dog be detecting some subtle sign of life that had escaped medical detection? The rational part of his mind rejected such possibilities, but the father who had lost his own daughter whispered that stranger things had happened. Margaret's sedative-dulled mind was racing with terrible possibilities. What if her dosage calculations had been wrong? What if Grace had fallen into some kind of coma that mimicked death closely enough to fool medical professionals? The thought was both horrifying and hopeful. If Grace was somehow still alive, then maybe there was still time to undo the terrible thing Margaret had done. As the first shovelful of earth hit Grace's casket with a hollow thud, Ranger's behavior reached a breaking point that would change everything. The sound of Ranger's claws scraping against the casket's white surface was like nails on a chalkboard, cutting through the solemn atmosphere of the graveside service with desperate urgency. The German shepherd's behavior had escalated beyond simple grief into something that bordered on frenzied panic, his powerful frame trembling as he threw himself against the sealed coffin with increasing violence. "Someone needs to control that animal," muttered Harold Peterson, one of the church deacons, but his words were lost in the chaos of Ranger's desperate assault on Grace's final resting place. Dr. Burke found himself stepping forward, his medical instincts overriding the social protocols of a funeral service. Something about the dog's behavior triggered memories of his own daughter's death, specifically the way their family cat had acted in Rebecca's final hours. Animals possessed senses that humans had lost to civilization, abilities to detect chemical changes and subtle variations in body temperature that modern medicine sometimes missed. "Wait!" Dr. Burke called out as James Washington and several other men moved to restrain Ranger. "Let me examine the casket first." The funeral director looked appalled at the suggestion. "Dr. Burke, with all due respect, the family has been through enough trauma. Opening the casket at this point would be necessary," Burke interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of decades in medicine. "This dog has been exhibiting unusual behavior since Grace's hospitalization. Animals can detect things we can't. Changes in scent, body temperature, even electrical activity. If there's even the slightest possibility—" Margaret Campbell suddenly lurched forward, her sedative-induced stupor giving way to a terrible clarity. "Open it," she whispered. Then louder, "Open the casket, please, doctor." "Burke, if there's any chance that Grace is still—" The crowd of mourners erupted in murmurs of shock and confusion. Some called for reason, insisting that Grace had been pronounced dead by qualified medical professionals. Others, swept up in the drama of the moment and moved by Ranger's obvious distress, began to wonder if the impossible might somehow be true. Bill Campbell stood frozen between hope and horror, his mind struggling to process the implications of what his wife was suggesting. If Grace was somehow still alive, then they were about to bury his granddaughter alive, a thought so terrifying that his knees nearly buckled beneath him. "This is madness," James Washington protested, but Dr. Burke was already kneeling beside the casket, running his hands along the sealed edges. "The child has been examined by multiple medical professionals. She's been dead for 4 days. "Then opening the casket will prove that, Doctor," Burke replied grimly. "And we can lay these concerns to rest along with Grace. But if Ranger is detecting something we missed—" The implications hung in the air like a sword over the assembled mourners. Pastor Mitchell struggled to maintain order as voices rose in heated debate about the propriety and sanity of disturbing a child's remains based on a dog's behavior. Some family friends supported the idea, moved by Ranger's obvious distress and desperate to believe that Grace might somehow still be saved. Others were horrified by the suggestion, viewing it as a desecration of the dead and a cruel extension of the family's suffering. Margaret's confession came pouring out in a torrent of guilt and desperate hope. "I've been giving her sleeping pills for weeks," she cried, her voice carrying across the cemetery. "Ambien ground up in her food. I thought I was showing mercy, saving her from a life of poverty. But what if the dosage was wrong? What if she's not dead, but just sleeping?" The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps of horror mixed with cries of outrage as the full extent of Margaret's actions became clear to those who hadn't known the circumstances of Grace's death. Some mourners backed away from the elderly woman as if she were contaminated with evil, while others moved closer, drawn by the morbid fascination of witnessing a confession to child murder. Dr. Burke's mind raced through the medical possibilities. Zolpidem toxicity could indeed cause a comatose state that closely mimicked death, especially in a small child whose system couldn't process the medication effectively. If the dosage had been calculated incorrectly, if Grace's metabolism had been slower than expected, if her small body had somehow managed to maintain minimal life functions below the threshold of detection. "James, help me open this casket, Doctor," Burke commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. "Now!" James Washington looked around desperately for support but found none. The crowd had divided into factions, those demanding that Grace be left in peace, and those swept up in the desperate hope that she might somehow still be alive. Bill Campbell's anguished face decided the matter. "Do it," Bill said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If there's any chance she's alive in there, we have to try." The process of opening the casket was agonizing in its deliberate pace. James Washington's hands shook as he worked the latches, his professional composure cracking under the pressure of potentially disturbing the dead. Ranger's behavior intensified as the seal was broken, his whines becoming sharp barks that seemed to urge greater speed. When the casket lid finally swung open, revealing Grace's peaceful form dressed in her yellow sunflower dress, a collective gasp arose from the assembled mourners. The child looked exactly as she had in life, beautiful, innocent, and utterly still. For a moment the crowd's hope deflated like a punctured balloon. But Dr. Burke was already leaning over Grace's small form, his experienced hands checking for signs that medical equipment might have missed. He placed his ear against her chest, listening for the faint whisper of a heartbeat that hospital monitors might have failed to detect. His fingers found her wrist, pressing against the pulse point with the delicate touch of someone searching for miracles. "There," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd's nervous murmuring. "There's something. It's incredibly faint, but—" Margaret Campbell collapsed to her knees beside the casket, her hands reaching toward Grace's face with trembling fingers. "Baby girl?" "Grace, honey, can you hear Grandma? Please, sweetheart, if you're in there, come back to us." Ranger pushed past the human barriers and placed his front paws on the edge of the casket, his nose inches from Grace's face. The dog's behavior had shifted from frantic desperation to focused intensity, as if he were trying to will his beloved companion back to consciousness through sheer force of loyalty. Dr. Burke pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911 with practiced efficiency. "This is Dr. Harrison Burke at Millbrook Cemetery. I need an ambulance immediately. We have a possible case of premature burial, a 6-year-old who may still be alive." The emergency dispatcher's confusion was audible even to nearby mourners. "Doctor, did you say premature burial? The child is in a casket?" "That's correct," Burke replied grimly. "We're dealing with suspected drug toxicity that may have been misdiagnosed as death. The patient shows possible signs of life, but extremely weak vital signs." As they waited for the ambulance, Dr. Burke began emergency resuscitation procedures right there in the open casket. He tilted Grace's head back to clear her airway and began chest compressions, his movements careful but firm as he tried to stimulate her heart and breathing. The sight of a distinguished physician performing CPR on a child in her own coffin was surreal, a scene that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. Margaret's breakdown was complete and public. She knelt in the cemetery dirt, her expensive funeral dress staining with mud as she begged forgiveness from her granddaughter, from God, and from anyone who would listen. "I'm so sorry, Grace. Grandma made a terrible mistake. I thought I was protecting you, but I almost killed you. Please come back to us, baby girl. Please give us another chance." The ambulance arrived within minutes, its sirens wailing as paramedics rushed across the cemetery with their equipment. The sight that greeted them was unprecedented in their collective experience. A funeral that had transformed into a rescue operation, with mourners gathered around an open casket while a doctor performed CPR on a child who was supposed to be dead. "What's the situation?" asked the lead paramedic, a veteran named Mike Rodriguez, who had seen every kind of emergency in his 20-year career. "Possible premature burial due to drug-induced coma," Dr. Burke explained quickly as he continued chest compressions. "6-year-old female, systematic poisoning with zolpidem over several weeks. Pronounced dead 4 days ago, but showing possible signs of minimal life functions." The paramedics took over with professional efficiency, connecting portable monitoring equipment to Grace's small form right there in the casket. The EKG leads showed a faint, but definite electrical activity in her heart, while a more sensitive pulse oximeter detected trace amounts of oxygen in her blood. "Jesus Christ," Mike Rodriguez muttered, forgetting his professional composure. "There's definitely something here. Heart rate is maybe 8 beats per minute, oxygen saturation barely registering, but she's alive. How the hell is she alive?" The answer lay in the cruel mathematics of Margaret's misguided mercy. Her calculations had been based on adult dosage guidelines, but she'd underestimated the remarkable resilience of a child's metabolism. Grace's small body had processed the drugs more slowly than expected, creating a state of suspended animation that closely mimicked death, but fell just short of the final threshold. As the paramedics prepared to transport Grace back to the hospital, Ranger refused to be separated from his companion. The German Shepherd jumped into the ambulance without invitation, positioning himself beside the stretcher with the authority of someone who belonged there. When the EMTs tried to remove him, Dr. Burke intervened. "Let him stay," Burke said firmly. "That dog saved her life. If we'd buried her today—" The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone present. Without Ranger's desperate intervention, Grace Campbell would have awakened in a sealed casket 6 feet underground, suffocating in the dark while her family mourned above. The loyal German Shepherd had somehow known what medical science had missed, that death had not yet claimed the little girl who had shown him kindness when the world had forgotten he existed. As the ambulance raced back toward Millbrook General Hospital, Margaret Campbell was left kneeling in the cemetery dirt, surrounded by the wreckage of a funeral that had become a resurrection. The truth of her actions was now public knowledge, but for the first time in days she dared to hope that her terrible mistake might not be the end of Grace's story. 6 months after the miraculous rescue at Millbrook Cemetery, Grace Campbell sat in the backyard of her grandparents' home, throwing a tennis ball for Ranger while golden afternoon sunlight painted everything in warm hues of hope and healing. The German Shepherd bounded after the ball with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age, his amber eyes bright with the joy that comes from having his beloved companion restored to him. The physical recovery had been faster than anyone had dared to expect. Within weeks of her resurrection, Grace's body had purged the last traces of the medication that had nearly killed her, and her natural childhood resilience had asserted itself with remarkable speed. The doctors at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where she'd been transferred for specialized care, called her recovery extraordinary and medically unprecedented, though Dr. Burke privately suspected that Ranger's unwavering presence had played a role that medical science couldn't quantify. The emotional healing had taken longer and required more delicate navigation. Grace had been aware during much of her comatose state, trapped in a twilight world where she could hear voices and feel touch but couldn't respond. The experience had given her a maturity beyond her 6 years, but also a deeper appreciation for the simple gifts of consciousness, movement, and the ability to express love. "Ranger saved me from the dark place," Grace often told visitors, her small hand resting on the dog's head with complete trust. "He never stopped calling me back home." Margaret Campbell's journey toward forgiveness, both from others and herself, had been the most difficult path of all. The legal system had been merciful, recognizing her actions as the result of severe depression and early-stage dementia rather than malicious intent. She'd been sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, mandatory psychological counseling, and community service at the local animal shelter, where she'd discovered an unexpected aptitude for caring for abandoned pets. "I understand now why you trusted Ranger before you trusted me," Margaret said to Grace one afternoon as they watched the dog chase butterflies through the garden. "Animals love purely, without the complications that make humans dangerous. He saw your soul when I could only see my own fears." The relationship between Margaret and Bill had required careful reconstruction, like archaeologists piecing together fragments of something precious that had been shattered. Marriage counseling sessions with Pastor Mitchell had helped them navigate the treacherous waters of betrayal, forgiveness, and the question of whether love could survive such a profound violation of trust. 47 years don't disappear because of one terrible mistake, Bill had told the counselor during one particularly difficult session. Maggie isn't evil, she's sick, and sick people need healing, not abandonment. The community of Millbrook had struggled with its own complicated feelings about the Campbell family. Some residents remained judgmental, crossing the street to avoid Margaret or making pointed comments about child killers when they thought no one was listening. But others had rallied around the family, organizing fundraisers to help with medical bills and offering practical support in the form of casseroles, babysitting, and the kind of small-town solidarity that emerges in the face of shared trauma. Dr. Burke had become an unexpected champion for the family, using Grace's case to advocate for better protocols in diagnosing death and the importance of listening to seemingly irrational concerns from family members and even animals. His medical paper about the case, titled "When Death Isn't Final: Recognizing Drug-Induced Coma States," had been published in the Journal of Emergency Medicine and attracted international attention to the phenomenon of misdiagnosed death. Grace's case taught me that medicine is still as much art as science, Dr. Burke explained to a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer. We rely so heavily on our instruments and protocols that we sometimes forget to trust the more primitive, instinctual knowledge that animals, and sometimes people, possess. The bond between Grace and Ranger had deepened into something that seemed to transcend the normal relationship between child and pet. The dog rarely left her side, even sleeping at the foot of her bed as if maintaining an eternal vigil against threats both seen and unseen. Grace had taught him tricks and games, but more importantly, she'd given him the kind of purpose that made his previous abandonment seem like necessary preparation for his true calling as her guardian. Financial pressures that had driven Margaret to her desperate act had eased considerably thanks to an unexpected source. Grace's story had captured national attention, leading to donations from strangers across the country who were moved by the tale of loyalty, redemption, and second chances. A GoFundMe campaign organized by Pastor Mitchell had raised over $200,000, enough to pay off the family's medical debt and establish a college fund for Grace's future. Sometimes I think God works through the most unlikely messengers, Pastor Mitchell reflected during Sunday service, his eyes finding the Campbell family in their usual pew with Ranger lying quietly beside Grace's feet. A homeless dog became the instrument of salvation for a little girl, and a terrible mistake became the foundation for a stronger family. If that's not divine grace, I don't know what is. The legal system had also shown unexpected compassion. District Attorney Sarah Chen, herself a mother of young children, had worked with defense attorneys to craft a sentence that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Margaret's community service at the animal shelter had connected her with other abandoned creatures, helping her understand the parallel between her own emotional abandonment and the pets she now helped heal. Working with these animals has taught me about forgiveness, Margaret explained to her therapist during one of their weekly sessions. They don't hold grudges or demand explanations. They simply accept love when it's offered and give it back without reservation. Grace learned that lesson from Ranger, and now I'm trying to learn it too. As Christmas approached, the Campbell household buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from having survived the unthinkable and emerged stronger. Grace had returned to school, where her classmates treated her with the mixture of awe and normalcy that children manage so naturally. Her teacher, Miss Chen, reported that Grace showed no lasting academic effects from her ordeal, though she did display an unusual empathy for classmates who were struggling with their own difficulties. The family had established new traditions around gratitude and communication. Evening dinners now included a ritual where each person shared something they were thankful for, with Grace usually mentioning Ranger's loyalty and Margaret often expressing appreciation for second chances. Bill had learned to ask direct questions about feelings and concerns, while Margaret had committed to transparency about her mental health struggles. On Christmas Eve, as snow began to fall over Millbrook and Grace hung stockings for the entire family, including an extra large one for Ranger, the Campbell home felt like a place where miracles lived alongside everyday love. The German shepherd lay by the fireplace, his steady breathing a reminder that vigilance and devotion could overcome even the deepest darkness, and that sometimes salvation comes with 4 legs and a faithful heart. For those of us in our golden years, we know that life's greatest blessings often come disguised as our deepest fears. The Campbell family's story reminds us that even when we feel like we're failing the ones we love most, redemption is still possible. Margaret's misguided attempt to protect Grace mirrors the anxiety many of us carry about becoming burdens to our families or making decisions that hurt rather than help. But this story shows us that love, even imperfect, frightened love, can be transformed into something beautiful through forgiveness and second chances. Like Ranger's unwavering loyalty, the bonds that truly matter transcend our mistakes and shortcomings. Grace's recovery wasn't just physical. It was a healing that touched 3 generations, proving that families can survive even the most devastating betrayals when they choose grace over judgment. For those of us watching our own grandchildren grow or struggling with the weight of past decisions, this story offers hope that it's never too late to rebuild trust, seek forgiveness, and create new memories together. What past family mistake are you still carrying that might benefit from honest conversation and forgiveness? Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal's instincts proved wiser than human judgment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.